When working in SOLID, sometimes it's helpful to zero in on a specific cluster. I will work with the example cluster in this lesson just to show some principles. It doesn't necessarily have to be the next thing you work on, but let me just isolate that one area and we can talk about it. So remember, in this list of markers, if I want to find records that have any of these markers, I can just click on one of those markers. So this will show me all records that have XV in it. Maybe I just want to see what's going on with it. So here I have a record that has some examples, and I see XV and XE, and there's 3 examples in this one. Now we see this RF, and if you recall, the plus sign means that it's inferring the RF. In standard MDF, the RF field is for a reference. It might be the notebook you got it from, or a sentence number, or the reference. It's some index of where you got the example. And many shoebox databases do have the RF field, and many others don't. They simply have XV and XE, or possibly with XN also for the national. They have the vernacular example, the English translation, and possibly a national translation. Now with this data, I don't know yet whether it actually has RF in it, so I'm going to ignore that for the moment, but I want to show you something that I do with the XV and XE. Now if I look over here, I can see that XV has 1911 and XE has 1901 occurrences. So that tells us that somewhere there's an XV that's missing an XE. Okay, I'm less worried about that. I'm more worried about an XE with no XV. So if we had an RF, technically both the vernacular and the translation are children of the RF, and so it's appropriate to set it up for them to be siblings. But I want to be a bit more restrictive. I want to test whether there are any XEs that don't have an XV. So for the purposes of SOLID, I'm going to pretend like the XE is a child of XV. Now it is not a child of it, but in SOLID it can be useful, that can be a useful fiction. You can pretend that it's a child in order to discover things about the order of the fields and the structure of the data. And there are other reasons it is useful to make the XE a child of XV, but I will get to those in a bit. So for now, I will come over to the XE marker, and remember the under column is the most important column. So I will click on the code that's there, and that will open up the settings box so that I can adjust the settings for XE. And recall, if you forget which marker you're on, you can look in the left pane, or you can look up here to see which marker it is. Okay, so it is telling me that the parent is RF, but I am going to pretend that the parent is XV. And I almost always do this in almost all the databases that I'm working on. So I will say it's XV. It can only occur once. I do want to report an error. And remember, this is our little clue about what it is. It shows you the parent marker, and then it can occur once. Now this comment came from the template. This was created by the default template. It was preloaded into SOLID. I can edit it if I want to, but it's trying to give us useful information. For now, I'm just going to leave it, and I'm going to ignore it. So I will click Close. So I have changed the setting, but SOLID hasn't done anything yet. So first I need to save it. When this disk is blue, that means you've made a change that you haven't saved. So I will click Save, and now the disk is gray, meaning I've saved all my changes. And now I'm going to do a recheck. Now, when you do a recheck, it takes you back to the first record of the database, and that's not where I want to be. I want to look at a record with XV. So I click on the XV over here, and now I'm back at the same entry I was before. And now you can see the XE indented under XV. So that's a bit more helpful. It's hanging off of it. Now, over in the error filters, let's see if there are any errors related to XV or XE. There are not. I only need to go to the bottom of the marker stuff. We're going to ignore the required fields and the consider for now. We'll look at those later. But if the marker could not be placed, it would be showing up somewhere in there. And no, I don't see any XV or XE. So all the XEs have a parent. So that's wonderful. Okay, so now I will look at RF. I want to know if there are any RF in the file. Now I could open the SFM file in Notepad++ and I could look for it. And hopefully you have already done an inventory of the markers, and that would tell you that there are none in this file. Now if you want a way to do that with solid, we can also do that. There's many ways to do various tasks. So here, when we look at the settings for XV, this little star here tells us that the XV is a required marker under RF, and the plus RF means that XV is inferring RF. Let me open that up and it will make more sense if you see the full settings. So here it says XV, the parent is RF. We've ticked the box for it must occur. So whenever there's an RF, there has to be an XV. And we've said if no parent, infer RF. And so that's why all these RFs have the plus, is because they're being inferred. So I don't want to infer them. So let's change this to just report error. I don't want it to gratuitously put them in. I need to know the difference between suggested RF versus real RF. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. I'm not going to bother with the must occur. I'm going to make as few changes as possible. If we need to address that, we'll come back later. So for now, I will put it on report error. I'll click close. I will click save because I don't want to lose my changes. Now it's still showing the inferred markers, so I have to click recheck before it will do it. And now if I go to an XV, here the inferred RF is no longer there. And actually, if I look in my marker list, there is no RF. Okay, so that tells me that this file has no RFs. So even though that is a part of the MDF standard, we don't need it. I mean, we could have inferred them and made the marker real, but there's no reason to have the RF here. So I'm simply going to say that the top of the tree for an example cluster is XV and everything else hangs off of it. So down here the XV is still saying that its parent is RF. So I do need to change that because there are none. Notice that these are all red. The reason they're all red is it's looking for that RF and it just isn't there. Now all the other things that are at the sense level say that SN is their parent. And we might change that, but for now they all say SN, so let's just be consistent with what everything else says. Keep in mind, in a future lesson we're going to look at the SNPS business. So I will click on this and I will get this settings dialog. So I want to change the RF, so I click on it and now it's selected and I can just type and it replaces it with XV, and if I click somewhere else then it takes. Now I do want to report an error. I don't want to, okay, it didn't like that. You can't make, I said XV. A marker can't be a parent of itself. I really meant SN. So I will make the marker SN. I will click somewhere else and then that will take. Now this is saying that examples must occur. And that is pretty restrictive, but there are plenty of entries that don't have examples, so I really want to untick that, and then the star goes away. So I don't want to say it must occur. And then in terms of the number, I know I said I want to start out as restrictive as possible, but in this entry we're looking at, there's already more than one example, and that's perfectly legitimate. So I'm going to say that there can be one or more together, but normally you don't want anything else between examples. So often for XV, this is the best setting for it, is the one or more times together. Okay, the parent is SN. It can occur more than once. It's not required. It's going to report an error. It's not going to infer something. So I think we're done. So let's click close. I will click save, and then I will click recheck. And so now It is complaining about XV, but that's because I said the parent was SN. But at least it's not looking for the RF anymore. So we'll deal with its parent later. Now I did want to do one more thing. Remember we said that there's a different number of translations versus vernacular. Actually, there's 10 fewer. And if we want to find those, what we could do, we can change the settings for XE. We'll click on its little code, move the dialog. If I wanted to say that it must occur under XV, then we'll be able to find those. Now, I probably don't want to leave it that way, but if I'm curious about them, then I can just do this temporarily. So let me click Save, and I'll do Recheck. And so now I look in here. Okay. It's still complaining about the XV. Okay, so the marker, I want to be in a different section. Okay, so required fields missing. We're going to ignore the first one. Required fields missing under XV. Those are the ones that we cared about. Now it says 9. The other one said 10. That has to do with some records that might have more than one example in them. This is telling you the number of records, not the number of times the field occurred. So I will click on that, and now it filters for the required field. And so here's one. We had example, translation, example. Now I don't know what the translation is. If I wanted to make the structure happier, I could put an XE. But Flex doesn't care, so I'm not going to go through that effort, but that's one possibility. And there may be other cases where to make the structure happy, you do need to do that. You don't know the contents, but at least put a blank one in there. And I will click Save, and then it reformats it so you can see where it is. So we'll move forward, and here's another one. I'm just going to leave it. So if I wanted to scroll through them, I could. Now here, okay, so this is on that first, there's a lot of XVs, but that first one is missing an XE. And actually, if I scroll down, here's another one missing an XE. You can easily see it because the black is missing. So I'm not going to do more with those right now because as long as the parent is there. Now, if there were XEs that were missing an XV, then I would definitely put in the empty XV because that's crucial for the structure. Now, we went over this pretty quickly, but remember I changed XV to have a different parent. Now, if I had left all of the record markers that are in the cluster, like XV and XE, and if there were an XN, if they were all pointing at the same parent, then I would have to change the parent for all of them. But because I made the XE hang off of XV, I only need to change the parent for XV, and the XE will come along with it. And especially if there were more than one analysis language, that can really save time. That makes it easier to manage and to keep track of what you're doing. So that's another reason I like to hang the XE off of XV. In case I need to change the parent of the whole cluster, I only need to change it on one marker. There are other places in the database structure where that kind of thing makes sense, where you want it hanging off of one, even though they're not technically children. It's helpful to be able to move a whole cluster all at once. It's sort of like a temporary parent. So I will stop there in terms of example clusters, but those are some things that you can do that are helpful, and they do apply to other places in the database as well.